So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Uzodinma Iweala as this morning's keynote speaker. Dr. Iweala graduated from Harvard with an AB in English and American Literature and received his MD from Columbia in 2011. So he embodies the kinds of social, intellectual, and political commitments that are central to this weekend's conference, and indeed to the work of many of us here today. Over the past decade, he has held many positions that highlight this commitment to the worlds of literature and medicine, ranging from the United Nations Office of the Special Envoy on Malaria and Colombia's Millennium Villages Project, focusing on public health issues in sub-Saharan Africa, to his work as co-founder and publisher, as editor, and as writer for organizations like Ventures Africa, Farafina Magazine, and the Pilgrimages Project, each of which focuses on sub-Saharan and Pan-African writing and publishing. He's perhaps best known to us as the author of two books, Beasts of No Nation from HarperCollins 2005, which tells the story of a child soldier in West Africa. Beasts of No Nation has been translated into 12 languages and won numerous prizes, including the Barnes & Noble's Discover New Writers Award, the New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Sue Kaufman Prize, the Los Angeles Times First Fiction Award, and the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize for the best first novel by a British or Commonwealth writer, and the Young Minds Award. The Guardian described it as a novel so scorched by loss and anger that it's hard to hold, and so gripping in its sheer hopeless life force that it's hard to put down. His second book, a nonfiction account of HIV/AIDS in Nigeria, is called Our Kinds of People and was published in 2012, so last summer. He's currently at work on his third book set in Washington, D.C., titled Speak No Evil, which was supported in part by a fellowship to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Iweala.
Good morning to everybody, and thank you all for having me and for being here so early on Saturday. It was difficult for me too. So I think this morning what I'm just going to do is talk a little bit about Our Kind of People and the process of putting this book together and writing it. Our Kind of People, as Cristobal mentioned, is the book that I wrote about HIV/AIDS in Nigeria specifically. And I'll just start a little bit with I'm basically from the beginning. I mean, it's actually not very far from here that the idea for the book came up. And I was walking down Broadway near Nasbamamu, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and if you're just coming here, you'll probably get familiar with it. It's a coffee shop. And occasionally, I think late at night on the weekends, people sell posters on the street, the kind of things that you would see in bus stops, movie posters, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the posters happened to be from this ad campaign, and I don't know if you guys will remember it, but it was all over the place in magazines like Vanity Fair, on taxi cabs, and on buses. The I Am African campaign, which basically had a bunch of Western celebrities in black and white with, like colored paint and sort of like tribal markings on their faces, which, is an interesting way of depicting what it means to be African, but, we can talk about that. And at the top of this poster, I actually have the poster. So I was with a friend, and I begged her to buy the poster for me because, of course, I had no money at the time on me at the time. And I bought it and I framed it and kept it in my apartment for a long time, just because I was so offended by it, but like so offended and intrigued, almost like one of those sort of like the blackface cartoons that you see. And at the top of this poster, there's this I Am African in bright, sort of big yellow letters, and then help stop the dying, right? At the bottom, and like help us fight HIV. I think it was for Save the Children. It was help us stop or deal with HIV/AIDS in Africa. And I mean, I don't know. It's something that I think that in looking at that poster, can everyone hear me? Okay, so in looking at that poster and thinking about the messages that came up about HIV/AIDS in Africa, I mean, it just got me very interested in who gets to speak about HIV/AIDS, who gets to speak about the epidemic, and then also how both people outside countries affected by the epidemic, most affected by the epidemic, speak, and then how people in countries affected by the epidemic speak about this epidemic in their midst, if it's spoken about at all, in both places. And then in thinking about this and doing a little bit more reading and research and just speaking with people, it became clear, that it seemed to me that there were a number of different, or three main representations ways of speaking about the epidemic, the HIV epidemic in Africa. And the first was this representation of otherness, right, which occurs often when people speak about Africa and the continent, and that HIV/AIDS was wrapped up in that. And then two is narratives of absolute difficulty, the sort of everyone is dying, we're all dying, conflict, poverty, whatever. And then three was this idea of giving thanks, right? That, and I'm sure you guys have also seen this idea of like the sort of happy African, like singing songs and jumping up and down and saying thank you so much for saving us from ourselves. And we've all seen these narratives all over the place, and I was wondering, like, is there another way of speaking about this epidemic that while it captures just the intensity of the experience that people have, and that's people living with HIV/AIDS and people who don't have it, who are living in this society as well, is there a way to capture the intensity of that experience and be honest about just how devastating the experience has been for many, many people in many countries, but at the same time not fall into these same traps that I think govern the narratives that people think about or would think about, and things are definitely changing now, but would think about when they thought about HIV/AIDS in Nigeria. And I'm just going to start by reading just a quick section of a book that I quoted when writing my book, and then I'll move into talking about something else. But I want to start with this because I think it's really interesting in terms of the narratives that sort of we think about when people think about sub-Saharan Africa. And so it goes, black shapes crouched, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced with a dim light, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. They were nothing earthly now, nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. And that passage is actually from Conrad's Heart of Darkness, written however long ago, I think, 1898, right? I think that is the date. So there's that, which sort of, the picture of Africa. And funny enough, 100 and some years later, right? The image in a lot of ways is still the same. Again, in recent years, just most recently, and this is like largely, I think, due to money moving into Africa after the financial crisis here, right? But for the most part, they're still the same attitudes. I remember watching, while doing the research, a documentary, a CNN documentary about HIV/AIDS in Africa, narrated by Christian Amanpour, called "Where Have All the Children Gone?" And it's the kind of thing where you just wonder, are we in 1898 or 1897, or are we in 2006? But basically, you have this whole this like, I don't know, dusty landscape on the screen, with Christian Amanpour narrating this like very sad music, and then these images of children sort of playing in the dust, and her asking these questions: where have all the parents gone? Africans are dying of HIV/AIDS, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm more specific about the book, but that's just to give you the scene and sort of what we think about, or what we have been thinking about when we think about HIV/AIDS, and sort of what, if you're going to write about HIV/AIDS, both for maybe a Western audience and also for, say, a Nigerian audience or an audience in sub-Saharan Africa, because some of these Western images are also very prevalent in other places, right? That's kind of the narrative that you're coming up against, and what you have to deal with and incorporate, and also sort of write against, if that's the right term, in speaking about or writing about HIV/AIDS. So that's just to give you a little bit of context. And so I decided that if I were because this thing affected me so much, and because I would find myself getting very irritated a lot and talking about it, but not really able to collect my thoughts, I thought one of the best ways to do this was to sit down and actually say, can you write a book? Can you actually, as opposed to just complaining about the representations that you see, can you figure out a way to do just what I said earlier, where you write about both the impact and the devastation, but also the ways that people are dealing with it, and more importantly, the ways that people are talking about it. So for that reason, when I sat down to write, I wanted to focus more on narrative than on statistics and on sort of epidemiology and on all the scientific stuff. What was really, really interesting to me was just how people spoke, and how, what they spoke about, and how, when I say how they spoke, I mean like how they were when they spoke about this thing that is the source of so much fear and so much pain. For that reason, I also thought that like the best way to do this was to work through interviewing people directly. So, there's a lot to read. There are a lot of, books that one can read about HIV/AIDS, about the stats of the epidemic, about that. But what I wanted to do is just get on the ground, sort of leave all that stuff to the side until after I had actually spoken to people, so that I wasn't as colored. I wasn't saying, like, let me go focus on this particular group of people. Let me talk to sex workers, let me talk to truck drivers. And I did speak to people in those groups, but I wanted to just start and see what kind of conversations you can have with people across the board. And then the other thing that I wanted to do was also be much more specific about the environment and the context. So I think there are a lot of books that have been written about the epidemic in Africa, Africa, the continent. But the epidemic is very different in different parts of the continent. I mean, what you have going on, in relationships to HIV/AIDS in Nigeria are very different, where you have a sort of a 3.6% prevalence rate, are very different from a place like Botswana, where you are up to 30% at times. South Africa, where, a quarter of the population between the ages of I think it's 15 and 45, are impacted by or positive, right? So that was also something that was very, very aware of, is making sure that I could be very specific and tell a more specific story. And obviously, I say that, but within Nigeria, you also have wide variations in the epidemic as well. Certain states with prevalence rates of less than 1%, and others where you have 12, 15%, and that's depending on where you are located in the country, if you're in the midst of a major transport hub, all of these things. But, again, I think being more specific, being more focused on one country was very, very important to me, because I think it just, in terms of the narrative for internally, right, and then also the narrative about this epidemic globally, I think the more that you can be specific about who is telling the story or where the story is being told, the more impact you have on people and the more effective you are in actually getting people to understand and relate to that story. It's hard to relate to this mass of Africans. It's much easier to relate to a person in Nigeria who is like you, maybe of the same socioeconomic status, who's dealing with the epidemic, who might react the same way that someone in New York might react, or easier to understand the story of a specific person who is HIV positive, who has had to deal and can really narrate those challenges that they have faced within the Nigerian context. So before I get into sort of some of the passages, I think that show what I was trying to do. I mean, I'll just give you an overview of what HIV looks like in Nigeria. So Nigeria has a population of about 170 million people, which is the largest country in Africa. About I think it's 1/5 of all people in sub-Saharan Africa are Nigerians. So chances are, if you've met an African person, you've met a Nigerian. 3.6% of Nigeria's population is HIV positive. And while that's a low number when you think about the epidemic, in terms of some of the other countries with much higher percentages of population impacted, that for Nigeria, that means because of our huge population, it's about 3.3 million people. So it's actually the third largest population of people living with HIV in the world. And then in Nigeria, you have each year approximately 200,000 deaths related to HIV and AIDS. And then at the same time, you have about 200,000 people each year who need treatment, who are getting treatment. Now, of the 3.3 million people, it's not that large a percentage. But I mean, I think the reason why I say that is to show that things are changing, and that there has been, and a lot of this is because of local communities being very vocal and very active in terms of demanding access to resources, access to treatment from the government. And then helping government to mobilize, to work with the international community. Things are getting better. There's a very coordinated response. And I think, in speaking with a lot of people now, what people say is that it's not that people don't know, it's that one needs to maintain awareness at the right pitch to continue channeling resources towards this area. And then in terms of the funding for dealing with HIV in Nigeria, funding comes from the Nigerian government, which has set up the National AIDS Coordinating Body, and then major donors like PEPFAR, the Global Fund, the World Bank, etc. So that's just to give you a brief overview. But now, I mean, for me, the writing about HIV/AIDS started from a very, as I said, one-on-one kind of personal level. And I'll start with this interaction I had with a driver, just a random driver who actually picked me up on the street in Nigeria. When we started talking about HIV/AIDS. And so I'll just read to you just a little bit of that interaction. So he said, "AIDS is real," the driver said, pondering for a notion, the notion for a moment while gnawing the end of a bleached wood chewing stick. He spat a gob of wet pulp out of the window and then turned back to me. This driver was probably the driver for one madame or living in the same Victoria Garden City neighborhood of Lagos where my family has a house. Now that he had dropped his employer at work, he had the time for a leisurely kindness otherwise unknown to constantly grinding Lagosians. I'd never met him before, and I probably shouldn't have accepted. In Lagos, you don't get into just anybody's car. But all the same, I was appreciative when he offered me a ride after seeing me walking from the Lekki Expressway where I could catch a taxi. I fidgeted in the passenger seat of the air-conditioned SUV. In the distance, the many skyscrapers of Victoria Island and down at the city center near the marina shimmered against an embankment of low clouds, and I remembered an uncle's sarcastic statement that from afar, Lagos actually looks like a wonderful city. Like New York, Lagos is a city of islands, and from the air you can see the massive lagoon that separates sections of the city on the mainland from the two large islands in the Atlantic Ocean. And the city's latticework of paved highways, occasional red earth side streets, and tin roofs looks deceptively peaceful. But in truth, this megalopolis, though impressive in scale, is frustrating beyond belief. It shimmered around us as we sat in the famous Lagos go-slow, or traffic jam. Cars and trucks stretched for miles ahead of us towards the city center and miles behind us towards its outskirts, where developers couldn't build houses fast enough for an exponentially growing population. Street hawkers roamed among idling vehicles and thrust everything from chilled soft drinks and perspiring bottles to steering wheel covers up against car windows. Lagos, the joke goes, is the one city in the world where, because of traffic, you can accomplish all of your shopping on the way to the market. That morning, the only forward movement came from the okadas, or the motorbike taxis, which buzzed through tight spaces between cars, leaving behind a trail of suffocating black exhaust as they passed. So I was on my way to see Rolake Odetoyimbo, who's the head of Positive Action for Treatment Access, an advocacy group related to causes for HIV/AIDS. And I was going to be late, even by Nigerian standards. PATA's offices were in the Ikeja section of Lagos on the mainland. And though I had budgeted about 2 hours for what should have been a half-hour drive, an incident on the road blocked movement. As the car idled in traffic, the driver and I had struck up a conversation about HIV/AIDS. AIDS is real, he said again after he removed the chewing stick from his mouth. His eyes flashed with annoying excitement before he spoke again. It's been here for generations with our forefathers, he said in the blasé tone of someone for whom besiegement is ordinary. We have a word for it, atobe. He mouthed the Yoruba word slowly, atobe. I repeated and then wrote it down. He sighed appreciatively. Yes, atobe. Someone who urinates until he dies, and until when the death comes, he has 6 or 7 sicknesses at the same time. We have known this thing since the olden days, but now the whites them come and call it AIDS. And so I think that was one of the very first conversations that I had about HIV. And I mean, I think what's interesting is just that, there are narratives of sort of this disease. I mean, whether or not he was speaking about HIV/AIDS, I think is not really the point. I think the idea that people have thought about this thing and have been speaking about this thing in various ways for a very long time, I think is really, really important. And then you superimpose on that this larger international narrative and this larger idea of what HIV/AIDS means. And then people have to deal with that as well, and so there's an interplay between those two things, like what people have seen and what they know and what they understand, and local ways of speaking about that versus what the international community sees, knows, and understands, and the stories about Africa that this fits into, and how those two things interact with each other. So that's again one of the things that I think that was really important that I was dealing with when trying to write this book and trying to move forward with it. So eventually, after sitting in traffic for a long time, I did get to Rolake, who I recently saw again in Abuja, actually at an event where someone was she's actually starting a school now for young women who are orphans of parents who've passed away from HIV and AIDS. And she's always wonderful to listen to, and always really, really wonderful as a speaker. But that was the first time that I ever met her, after hearing about her from a number of other people. And I'm sure some of the people who are very involved with HIV/AIDS globally have probably heard her speak. She's on a number of boards and things, but when I first met her, and she was a little bit annoyed that I came late, because I was about 4 hours late, actually. But she waited, which was very kind of her. She said to me in a somewhat rushed interview, she said, "My face is the face of HIV." She opened her arms as she spoke to indicate like the whole community, the international activist community dealing with HIV/AIDS. She said, "We've sold ourselves short. We've created this impression that Africa is poor, hungry, and beggarly children, and all this glamorizing poverty to whip up sentiment and fundraise. It's emotional blackmail. HIV is not a disease of the poor; it's a disease of the working class." Right? I mean, I think what she was trying to say, I mean, it clearly is a disease that's attached to poverty, but I think what she was trying to say is that, like, you can't narrate this disease as something that, you know, and the people affected by it as people who have absolutely no agency, which I think is what generally has or had happened a lot before people like her really started speaking about what it means to live with HIV/AIDS. You know, and she comes from a sort of a middle-class background in Nigeria and has, excuse me, and her life was changed quite dramatically, I think, by getting, when she found out that she was HIV positive. You know, and I think, you know, based on her experience, she wanted to say that, look, my experience is probably more common than people think. And that's whether or not people have some of the resources I have or don't. But my experience in the sense that I have agency, I'm not just something which is acted upon. That, like, I also can act when faced with this epidemic, right, or when faced with this disease that is now in my body. Like, I can act and I still have agency. And I think that's what she was trying to convey, you know, when I spoke to her and when she speaks to people into larger groups. You know, and so she said, look, if you want to really think about HIV/AIDS, like, you also shouldn't just speak to people like me. You need to go out and speak to as many different kinds of people as you can in Nigeria, and just, you know, whoever you can speak to, people who are positive, people who are not positive, policymakers, whatever, go and speak to them and, like, see what you can construct in terms of a narrative. And so I took that advice seriously, and that's kind of how the book came about. Now, the thing about speaking about HIV/AIDS in Nigeria, of course, is that it's not something that people really want to speak about all that much, right? It's a disease that has a lot of stigma attached to it for various reasons. You know, and so stigma obviously was a big part of the discussion. But, you know, what I found was that once people got comfortable with me as a person, then the narratives started to flow a lot easier. And I think that's something that you know, perhaps I hadn't bargained for in writing nonfiction, and, you know, that I think a lot of people maybe don't consider when writing about Africa, is that, like, you are, you know, I mean, maybe all the anthropologists and ethnographers and whatnot, but I am not one of those. So it was not something that came to me at first, but that, like, you are as important to the story as the story is itself. And so that's one of the reasons that when writing this book, I mean, I agonized for a very long time about whether or not to write it from my own perspective or to be more distant and write maybe more as a journalist, be more objective. And I came down to the idea that, like, so much of what was told to me and how it was told to me was really because it was me, right? And then if it were another person, that would really happen, and the story would come out in a very different way. So I decided to really try and include myself in the story and be much more subjective, you know, and to push in that direction and move away from trying to be distant and from the stories that are told and from my interactions with people. You know, and so one of the, after meeting with Rolake, one of the first people that I went to speak to was this woman who I've named Hope in the book, from this town in southeastern Nigeria, which is actually where my family is from, in the southeastern region of Nigeria, called Owerri. We're from about an hour or 45 minutes east of this place, but, you know, it's generally Igbos who live in this area. You know, and that creates a particular interaction. You know, I show up there, I have an Igbo name, but I sound the way that I sound, of course, and I don't speak Igbo, right? So that creates a particular, it's always a very funny way of relating to people, but it means that in some ways, like, you have to, you know, I think there's this, like, who are you really? Like, you're from us, but you don't really want to be part of us. I mean, I think question that arises first, you know, but anyway, we got over that. And then the other thing, of course, is that, like, in meeting someone like Hope, who lived in a sort of a more secluded section of the city, in this housing development that hadn't been completed. So it was like a combination of houses that were finished and sort of abandoned houses. Like you're also confronted with sort of this idea that like you are never very far away from other forms of existence in Nigeria. I mean, I think that it's very easy to come into Nigeria and have a very sort of an existence that doesn't acknowledge maybe what's happening in a lot of other parts of the country. And then, in a lot of ways, but you're not very far away from this at all in your own village, in other parts of the country. So I went to speak to her, and she started telling me the story of how she found out that she was HIV positive, and it was actually her husband who found out first. Her husband was owned a transport business. He owned a couple of trucks and would move goods from like all around southern Nigeria. So, I was speaking with her, and she told me, and it was actually a conversation we had in her living room. She said, I wedded in January 2001, and then we discovered this thing in September of 2001, she explained. At the moment they find that thing out, he was not happy. He said, hi, what will I do? I said, there's no problem, I'm your wife. The moment he found out, the man, he got confused. If you're advising him, just relax, that the thing has never started, just relax, they just find it out. He said, no, a man like me, a popular person, because he did deal with big, big men. He said he won't stay watching himself and let people know that he has this problem, that it's better that he die. It's better that he just die, she said softly. And, as we were speaking, it was hard not to detect a hint of resentment in her appraisal of her late husband's behavior, as if his conduct, this idea that he should die, was somehow unbecoming a man of his status. And so I think for me that statement, that sort of that tension that she was showing, and even speaking about her husband, who she thinks had probably killed himself not too long after finding out that he was HIV positive, versus she didn't. They have 2 children who are teenagers now, but this idea that you can't speak about this thing, that there's no outlet because of the stigma attached to this disease. And she was not necessarily an activist. I mean, she was just living her life each day. But at the same time, I think that, for her, that getting up and living her life, and then she would go and try to encourage other people who are HIV positive, not speaking nationally, but one-on-one, to go and get treatment and to be more open about having the disease. I think was her own way of dealing with it, just finding some outlet. Because otherwise, I think at the time, and again, it has gotten a lot better. And that now that there's been, over the last 10 years, much more of a national conversation about HIV/AIDS and what it means in Nigeria and how, as a nation, we can deal with it. Again, it's not. I mean, I'm not talking about everyone sitting down, holding hands, and singing "Kumbaya," but at least it's out there. The ad campaigns that are being run, sort of raising awareness, have definitely, you can see a shift, a big shift over the years, in terms of how AIDS is presented, from one, AIDS, this big, very scary thing, oh my God, don't get it, to now, okay, AIDS is here, let's deal with it, let's figure out how we can understand this epidemic. So, that's one example of someone just dealing with it in that way, and dealing with the stigma and how stigma shuts down conversation. But, I spoke with another lady who's, again, more outspoken, who spoke, again, more specifically about stigma and how stigma prevents people from speaking about this disease and conversations from happening. And she was talking about communities that you would think would be supportive, that are, again, growing more supportive, but at the time were not. She was speaking about her church, and she was saying, this is now a woman that I met in Lagos. Even in my church, they saw it as a big taboo. The way that the preacher would be preaching and saying things, we're telling people, don't be a prostitute when you're young. You should behave well. You should have good upbringing. I felt he was passing the wrong information because I, as far as I'm concerned, had a good upbringing. I wouldn't justify that I was a saint, but I know to a great extent that I had a very good upbringing. I felt that the man was passing the wrong information, and that information was scary. He was putting the immediate society in a tight corner because among the people there, you couldn't tell me that I was the only person who was positive in that church. You can imagine that the wrong information that he might be sending to a man or that woman who's HIV positive, that you're a prostitute, you're a bad person. He was being too judgmental, so you go home judging yourself to death. Oh, I'm a bad person. I don't even deserve to live in this world anymore. Oh, nothing good can come out of me. Those were the messages that were always surrounding the pastor's message, the message of death, judgment, guilt, and failure. And I think initially when people were speaking about HIV, and this is both on the national level and also on the global level, there was a lot of, just a lot of judgment passed, right? That while you're talking about it, and great, it's out there, you're saying HIV exists, like this thing is here, but the be afraid, oh my God, if you have it, you're a bad person, really shuts down a lot of discussion and really prevents people from speaking about their experiences. And that's, I think, both on a sort of a local domestic level in situations like this, and then also just generally how people speak about HIV/AIDS in Nigeria at that time, to the international discussion, right, where, again, wrapped up in ideas of Africa as a backwards place, as a place where nothing good ever happens. In particular, and I talk about this, I devote a whole chapter to it in the book, about the discussion of sex and its relationship to HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, and this idea that somehow, some way, Africans were just more sex crazed than everyone else, right? And that's the reason why the epidemic is all over the place in sub-Saharan Africa, which people found is just not true. That it's just not the case, but that it's different ways of interacting sexually. But it's not that Africans are just having sex all over the place. But these ideas that map to the way that people think about HIV or think about Africa, and the epidemic itself is brought into that conversation and uses justification for some of the ideas that people have initially, as opposed to sort of questioning how these ideas came about in the first place, and then and trying to reshape those ideas within the context of the epidemic. So that's just to give you sort of a background about why and how it is difficult to speak about HIV/AIDS in Nigeria. And again, I wrote the book. I started doing the research in 2005, and it's now 2013, and so a lot has changed in terms of the conversation. And in terms of people's familiarity with the epidemic, and generally just a lot less hysteria, I think, both in country and then also globally about the epidemic, especially because after the initial push, right, there was quite a bit of activism in the forms of things like this I Am African campaign and others, more nuanced, that did bring the thing to the forefront, and also in talking about it that way allowed us to talk about how we talked about it. And then move into maybe more refined ways of speaking about the epidemic and how we can deal with it. And for that reason, there is more money going to things like treatment. There's just more money and going to spurring conversation about HIV/AIDS. And in Nigeria, it's actually become a thing that people talk about quite a bit, both in sensational and also not sensational terms. It's in some ways also a bit of a joke, right? Because it's such a part of, when I say bit of a joke, it's become the subject matter of a joke, which is interesting. I remember being in an airport in Lagos and looking up, and there's a huge, big poster on the wall, and I think it says something like, in big bright red letters, like AIDS, right? So you can't not see it, and it's like, now that we have your attention, please remember to make sure that all your baggage is with you and have a safe flight. And I think that it's play safe and have a good flight. And I think that's a really fascinating thing, right? Because at the same time it's passing the message along, it's also acknowledging that look, this thing is here. We all talk about it, right? And we're all aware of it, but it need not necessarily be this crazy thing that we just have to talk about in a serious context. That it has shaped the way that we talk about sex. It's shaped the way that we think about ourselves. So let's bring that into the conversation a little bit more. Also might say something about Nigerians' particular sense of humor, but I'll use that to just segue into sort of a longer section that I'll read about the way that people are speaking about HIV/AIDS in different forms. So how it has worked itself into the popular dialogue, right? That you've got things like that. You've got songs about HIV/AIDS, specifically about HIV/AIDS, or where it comes up in the subject matter, and then you of course have narratives, books that people are writing, fiction about HIV/AIDS. You have, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Nollywood, right? These popular Nigerian movies. There are a lot of movies that are made. These movies all have this, in some sense, a particular a moralizing streak to them, where it's don't rob, because if you rob, then you'll end up in jail. And there's this whole soap opera narrative about some armed robbers, and then at the end they end up in jail, and then you have this thing that's God is good, don't rob, stay out of trouble kind of thing. And I've seen, and while I was doing the research for this book, I would, watch a number of films about HIV/AIDS. A lot of it was tied to sex, but just to show that this, it's artists are taking this on, right? Creative people are taking this on, are really trying to construct a narrative, a Nigerian narrative, or various Nigerian narratives about what HIV means. And so I actually met, also in Owerri, I came back another time. I met this activist, his name, I named him Felix in the book, who was very, just, kind of a random guy from Owerri who had decided to, had various jobs working on a ship that went from like all along the coast of West Africa, working in Lagos as a construction person, and finally came back to his hometown to stay after his father had passed away, to really take care of his family affairs, and then had seen that HIV AIDS was a problem in his village that no one really wanted to speak about, but that was really, really having an impact on the community. And so what he did was organize a bunch of youths in the community, and a lot of villages have youth associations and whatnot. So he got them all together and decided that he was going to work with them to talk about something that nobody really wanted to talk about, but that was clear was really having an impact on the village and village life. And it's interesting. So before I came back to this AIDS Day that he had organized in his community, I had spoken with a bunch of the other like younger kids, people my age, and then my age in 2006, 2005, so early 20s, and like younger kids in the village, and there were a lot of stories, and a lot of people had a lot to say about HIV/AIDS. Oh, this person came back from such and such a place to die in the village, and nobody really wanted to talk about it, but everybody was whispering that it's HIV/AIDS, so we all know that it's AIDS. How do you get HIV/AIDS? Different narratives about how one contracts HIV that were both factual and also not factual, right? But again, that's just to say that it's not that people. I think the perception is that like no one wanted to talk about it, which is not true. It's that people were talking. It's not like an above ground discussion. But there are all these stories and narratives that are sort of flying around, and he wanted to bring that to the front and like challenge the community itself to talk about this in an open fashion, and it was so he invited me down actually to come to this day that he had organized, and it was a really fascinating and kind of uplifting day to see just different ways of dealing and speaking about the epidemic. So I'll just read to you a little section from that, and then we can just talk. So this is just starting in the middle of this HIV day and this drama. From nowhere, a young man appeared in the middle of the road, arm raised to his forehead in frozen salute. He wore a white cloth around his waist. The rest of his body was painted white from head to toe, and he wore black wraparound sunglasses. The word AIDS was painted in green across his chest, and when after a long pause he finally turned around, I saw that slogan found in so many social marketing campaigns, AIDS is real, dripping down his back, in the same green paint. He began a slow, comical imitation of a soldier's march down a small stretch of road. The first segment of youths followed him closely, holding candles in their hands with flickering flames that in broad daylight were almost visible. The village road filled with young bodies, and the air grew heavy with a feverish call. Fight, fight, fight AIDS. The shrill voices of young women came to the point of cracking at the last minute, bolstered by young men's deep and rumbling call to arms. Fight, fight, fight AIDS. Together they sang, and I'm not going to sing, Today, today, I might just sing it. Today, today, tomorrow no more. If we fight AIDS today, we go fight 'em no more. They clapped and stomped and ululated. The whole group blobbed from one side of the road to the other as curious drivers slowed to observe the commotion. I wasn't sure if the younger marchers in the procession, the 10-year-olds, understood exactly why they were marching, but they seemed overjoyed to be a part of something larger than themselves. They weaved among older kids who seemed equally thrilled by the moment. Today they could speak so freely about something so taboo. As the group proceeded down the village road, the noise they generated called people from their houses to porches and front steps. A man appeared in his doorway in green slacks and an undershirt, his eyes dull with sleep. His 2 young daughters stood beside him in white dresses and head ties, all 3 captivated by the shouting, singing youth. After a moment, he smiled, clapped his hands, and shouted words of encouragement. All along the road, this scene repeated itself. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, friends. They appeared at windows and on front lawns, on porches. They were in the car sliding by, and they cheered, they clapped, they honked. I looked for Felix. He cautiously navigated the gutter's edge by the side of the road as he tried to provide subtle direction while letting the youths lead the way. His shirt clung to his body in places where the heat and humidity made him sweat. This is amazing, I said to Felix when I managed to work my way through the mass of people over to him. My brother, was his only reply. He turned to face a car approaching the group, waved to the driver to slow down. Have you seen this? Believe me, young people are looking for something to say. They are looking for people to come out and lead them. They know what these problems are, and they are looking for someone that will come out and tell them, let's start doing something to fight this problem. This is creating a lot of awareness in the community. People who have seen are going to be touched by this. Young people who have been affected by HIV/AIDS are the people carrying out this message. Young people will learn from each other, and they will say, who am I when my mates are actually on the road shouting anti-HIV/AIDS songs? Why shouldn't I join them? And before you know it, behavior change starts to set in, gradually. When I asked Felix what the older people in the community would think about the day's events, he responded, they are very happy about it. You're going to see them at the hall. They're all watching. They know these problems are here, but they don't know how to tackle it. That's the problem, you see. When young people do things themselves, older people now come in. I've been able to sample their opinion, and I know that they are very much interested here. They like what's happening. Indeed, when the Youth March returned, the newly painted hall was filled with adults who sat in the dimness fanning themselves. They were either unaware or chose not to comment on the fact that the balloons dangling from the ceiling above them were actually inflated condoms. As each marcher entered the meeting hall, he or she dripped a bit of wax onto a concrete platform a single step off the ground, which served as a stage, and fixed his or her candle to the right of the platform until they had formed a large blazing AIDS ribbon. Then once reassembled on stage, they broke into religious praise songs. In the darkness outside, thunder rumbled in the distance when the keynote speaker finally took the stage. He was a slight man with light brown skin and a pencil-thin mustache above his upper lip, and sweat soaking his clothes from the exertion of clapping and shouting in affirmation. His forehead was a glistening arc in the hall's dim light. For a moment before he spoke, the room was completely still. The chorus had stopped humming and stood silently behind him, next to the flickering candlelight AIDS ribbon. He wasn't from the village, and no one had seen him before. The way his face, his white garment caught in the candlelight, how his face shone, and the intensity of his gaze in that sliver of a moment before he opened his mouth, made me feel that I had stumbled into a seance. He said he was HIV positive. The room hushed because none of us knew. You would never have been able to tell by looking at him. AIDS, he shouted, AIDS, am I doing something? AIDS means ask yourself, am I doing something? Nigerians have a talent for inventing alternative meanings for acronyms. NEPA, the old Nigerian Electric Power Association, quickly became Never Expect Power Again. And when renamed the Power Holding Corporation of Nigeria, or PHCN, it was popularly called Problem Has Changed Name. Despite the heat and the late hour, which had drawn the sound of tree frogs and crickets from the surrounding foliage, the audience perked up. Am I doing something? Should I be doing something? Their newfound attention asked. What can I do? The speaker stalked back and forth from one side of the stage to the other, fluidly switching between English and Igbo, tossing long strings of one language out to the audience along an accusatory finger and then punctuating them with short syllables from the other, his yeso and ehe, mirrored in stereo surround by the villagers in front and the youthful chorus behind. AIDS, am I doing something? The speaker asked again. Am I doing something? The audience responded for the last time before the speaker released them, putting an end to the night. The villagers filed away, chattering about what they had just seen and experienced. Felix and I hung around after the last of the villagers had departed. I helped him to take down the balloons. I actually didn't know they were condoms, he said, laughing. Can you imagine these use? We finished by scraping the expended wax bits from the candlelight ribbon on the floor. Outside, it was raining heavily, and we stood at the door watching large drops batter the car windows and turn the red earth into a shifting mass. I asked Felix what it means to do something, and he said, I often tell people, you don't really need money to do the little things that you think are not really making some impact in people's lives. But by the time you do it 100 times, 200 times, and you put them together, all I know is that I'm actually doing this thing with my whole heart. I like what I'm doing. It's giving me joy. The little money that it's going into my pocket, I'm satisfied with. My salary is 5,000 naira. There's a lot of my mates that are going home with 100,000 naira, working in better places. There's a lot of my mates that work for one business or another, making their millions. But I think this is what my heart appreciates. I have a calling, or maybe I should say that this is a calling because I think my whole mind, my whole spirit is appeased with what I'm doing. I feel like I'm impacting somebody's life. I feel like I'm doing good. I feel I'm in love with it. You're in love. I was taken by his choice of words and the passion in his delivery, his insistence. His face was something different at the moment, his eyes wide, nostrils flared, his lips a thin, thoughtful line. Yes, you know, when you're in love with a woman, you can actually do everything for that woman. You can give the woman your time, you give the woman your life, you're patient. When you're in love with a woman, you'll always want to do everything for the person. And that's the way it is with me with this thing. So I asked, do you think programs like this actually change things? I'm very hopeful, Felix said, after some time. I believe that the prevalence of HIV/AIDS will still have to come down, but that will be dependent on the level we are taking this work to. We need to get more committed. It has to go beyond rhetoric, talking about it just because you feel. People have to be committed to it. People have to start realizing that local action involving the community members is what will really work. That's the only way it can be sustained. For people to really modify their behavior, you need to keep bombarding them with the same information. And as long as this information is coming from members of the same community, it will make a whole lot of sense. So, thank you very much.
So thank you, and I think we have some time for discussion. And I believe we're being recorded, so if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please come to one of the microphones at the front of the room.
Thank you so much for your reading. I actually teach this narrative health and social justice class here, and I teach your piece, Stop Trying to Save Africa, from the Washington Post, and one of my students is writing on your first book, their final paper. But I was curious as to, you started with this great critique of the white savior narrative, that I am African kind of narrative. But you pointed to your own role as kind of an insider-outsider, that kind of showing up and you're from us, you're not from us. If you could speak to kind of the reception of your work here and then in Nigeria, because there's always this tension of, as you said, trying to propose a different narrative, a narrative that's about agency, not a narrative that's about lack or rescue or, communities needing rescue. But then how do you negotiate kind of that role as a writer who's an insider-outsider?
Right. I think for me, it's always, and it's a complex thing, right? Especially because I think when being in Nigeria, I'm reminded very much of how, I was born here and I grew up here, and only recently really just moved to Nigeria. So I'm reminded quite a bit about how much my view is shaped by having been in this environment. In terms of reception, this book was supposed to have come out in Nigeria this year, but it's been delayed, so I'll have to wait and see specifically when it does come out, which hopefully, at the end of this year maybe or early next year. But, for my first book, which is in some senses maybe more problematic, this is like, this is in some senses maybe my own internal reaction to the first book, and response to it. The first book was about child soldiers, and it was very sort of intense first person that deals a lot with sort of, from research that I did, right, a lot of the not so fun aspects, if there are fun aspects of being a child soldier, but, and when I was writing it, and I think, I have, and we talked about this, I think, on Thursday when we talked about how people interpret your work. I obviously had what I was trying to get across when I wrote it, and there are certain elements of the narrative in that book that very specifically point to that, and you might have to really read to understand what I was trying to do, right? But reception, and in Nigeria, sometimes people would ask, well, you say that you're about, this positive representation, and yet this book that you wrote is so not necessarily positive in terms of its representation. And I think, this is all to say that it's very hard. What I'm committed to doing, right, is looking at some of these hard questions and looking at some of these hard emotional issues. And that means that you're going to have a dialogue or have to write about things that don't necessarily represent you or the place that you're from in the most positive light. But I think for me, when it comes to questions of agency and representation, it's all about having a multiplicity of voices, and within the text itself, having a nod to or trying to really show characters that have agency in that sense, right? So that whether it's the main character of the book who says at one point to someone that interviews him, like, look, you're looking at me like some helpless kid, but in reality, the life I've lived because of the experiences I have make me very, very powerful, right? And you need to understand that. Or within this book, speaking to people who would not necessarily have the chance to speak about their experiences because no one will come and interview them, right? People would much rather interview some celebrity or something like that rather than, just the average person walking down the street who is really impacted by the epidemic, whether they have HIV or not, but just really sees this epidemic, and it does impact the way they think about themselves, the way they think about having sex, the way that they think about relating to people who they don't know within the society. I mean, I think that that's important. It's important that that narrative get out there, right? Now, in that sense, like, because I have access to maybe a broader segment of the global population than, say, somebody who's sitting in a village in eastern Nigeria, that puts me in a position where I can take that story and not only show that story, but, I mean, really, show how my narrative and my sort of, I hate that term, but like that sort of hybrid existence interacts with that particular narrative, and then bring that to a wider audience. And I think that's what, in writing about HIV/AIDS, that's what I was trying to do, is not just say, like, look, there are these narratives. I mean, I could have taken all the interviews that I had done and just put them together in a book, like transcribe them and like, okay, here, everybody read. But I think what was really interesting for me was like how my own being of these places, and then also, like, I wrote the book while I was in med school as well, like having, and I think there is a definite change over the course. Before I started, I had no sort of background knowledge and hadn't done any, personally also hadn't really done any work with people living with HIV/AIDS, and then having done 2 rotations with the HIV team at Columbia Presbyterian, like that also impacted the way that I thought about this epidemic, the disease itself, and the epidemic in Africa, or in Nigeria specifically, right? So that interaction to me and my understanding and my growth is as much a part of that story. And that, I think, is in a lot of ways my job, right, is to tell that story and to make it clear to people that I'm telling that story of that interaction, and not just I am a representative for these people, because I'm not really. Those people can speak for themselves. It's just I'm telling how I interact with those people. And I think it's important to make that distinction, right, which I think a lot of times in narratives about HIV, like, it just doesn't, or about sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't happen as much. There's a lot of speaking for without acknowledging that it's really an interaction, right?
Yeah, I was sort of curious. I covered political conflicts in Africa in general for 2 years, and I was in Nigeria a few years ago. I was sort of curious to get and people talked about AIDS in Nigeria, but they talked about it back in the 80s in different countries I was in. So I'm sort of curious about your perception about how that has evolved, because all the countries have different kinds of ways of dealing with it. Zimbabwe, South Africa, etc. And here in the United States, I even remember in the 80s people talking about the monkeys, the monkeys transposing into the humans. I mean, people would satirically refer to that in South Africa. So how do you see the perceptions? Have you gotten into the question of how people are sort of perceiving this crisis in different societies in Africa as opposed to the general perceptions in the U.S. and elsewhere?
Right. I mean, I think, well, just to start, it's funny that the comment you make about monkeys is not, I mean, like, people were joking about it, but people weren't actually, but they actually weren't joking about it in a lot of ways, too. I mean, in doing research for this book, I read a bunch of papers by, like, respected people who, like, had that as a theory, right?
There were conferences here at Columbia where people reviewed that about...
Right. No, and I'm just saying, so we're talking now about the evolution. Right. I'm just saying that, so that, like, and again, when I say this, like, it's just to talk about, like, where people were starting from, right? And it's always an evolution. I mean, in Nigeria specifically, right, and I think, and the thing is, like, I think in general, the way that the epidemic was perceived all over the place in its various stages is like, highly similar, right? I mean, I think when HIV first appeared here, right, there was a lot of denial, like, oh, it doesn't exist, then, oh, it only exists within these specific communities. And then, like, it moves to, okay, how can we speak about it? How can we speak about it? It's something that we all have to deal with, right? In Nigeria, I think the first case was 1985 or 86, right? After which you didn't really hear anything about it, right? And then you went through successive military governments who were just like, this thing isn't here, like, we don't have it. Or then in, like, the early 90s, a nod to this epidemic does exist, and will fund some agency to deal with it, but like they fund the agency with like at the time 10,000 naira, which is like what, $10,000 at the time, when the naira was at parity with the dollar, right? And like which is not really going to do anything. And then you moved into really sort of 1999 when we went back to democratic government with President Obasanjo, who very problematic figure, right? Who was a former military dictator, but who made it a mission to really say a lot about HIV/AIDS and its impact on society, right? And so he was very vocal about it. He spoke quite a bit about it, and took great pains to, in the military, sensitize people in the military about it. And then also, on the sort of African stage, really work with leaders in Africa to say, look, this epidemic exists, and in Nigeria we have to do something about it. So it was around the time that he became president that NACA, which is the AIDS coordinating body in Nigeria, was formed. And from there, you then had, an evolution again. Like, you started off with messages that really focused on the fear, right? And on how this disease is so terrible, and don't get this. If you get this, like, you're going to die. AIDS is death. And you saw those. Like, those were part of campaigns in the beginning. And then, like, as you start talking about this disease, right, and as people who have the disease feel like they can come out and start saying much. And for the first people who were able to come out and say, look, I'm HIV positive, this is my experience. Some of those people I interviewed in the book, right, it's a very, very difficult thing for them and their families, but their conversations and their ability to talk to people and deal with the heat that, and the judgment that came made it a lot easier for a lot of other people to talk. And then you had, towards like 2001, 2002, 2003, you had this growing activist community that really made itself very heard, was very vocal and made itself heard, and was able to get people to talk about HIV/AIDS in a more nuanced fashion. Now, it's not a perfect discussion, right? And I don't think it ever is in any place. But I think what has happened is that as opposed to these dialogues of fear and judgment, right, you've moved away from that to more, look, we're all living in this environment, right? We're all affected by this epidemic. How do we deal with it as a society, as opposed to how do those people deal with the problem that they have, right? And the issue, in speaking to people now is more like, how do you sustain that message, right? Which is not one that like necessarily moves people to immediate action, right? Those danger narratives, the fear narratives, like really get people up and out of their seats. Are like, okay, we have to do something about this right now. Versus like, look, this is not just those people's problem. It's our whole problem. But we need to sustain the flow of resources. We need to sustain the flow of attention in sort of a respectful fashion, right? One that like acknowledges that this is a very complex disease, and that these are like everyone who has to deal with it. That's people who are positive, people who are not positive, policymakers, whoever, right? Are all complex people with many different viewpoints on the disease. And so you see people talking more about, like how do you involve religious leaders and sort of what message should they convey, knowing that they also have particular ideas that they have to think about, in terms of their own understandings of sex, morality, and whatnot to their congregations. But how do you then figure out how to speak about HIV/AIDS with them, and then have them deliver a message? Because so many of us are religious people in Nigeria. How do you speak with policymakers who might not be as educated on this thing as one would hope? And like, how do you get them to craft a message that makes sense? And then, more importantly, how do you deal with making sure to sustain the flow of resources, which is a whole other conversation between, the state and international donors, the state and its own budgeting people, right, who have to direct the flow of resources to something that, like, when you think about it, right, you say 3.6% of the population, someone's going to sit up and say, like, well, I have more acute problems in other places, right? And so I can't be necessarily directing this much money to this problem when we have all these other things that we need to talk about, right? And so it becomes a part of this national dialogue, and I think that's kind of where we are now. But it's still a confusing discussion, but one that is, from what I understand, being had, and I think will continue to be had for a while. I hope that gets at what you're...
Yeah. Thanks. So we have one and then two. Yep.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about moving away from content more a little bit into process, and what you were observing in the actual power of the telling, what was happening with these individuals as the story was emerging, and also your role in that emerging story. In other words, there was a piece when you were reading about, you were saying, you were commenting, and I'm very, very interested in that flow, because we think about that a lot, especially in medical education, as we have students who are working in eliciting story, co-creating stories with patients, and working on areas such as sense of agency in their own behavioral choices and things like that. So I'd really like to hear more about that process.
So to start, just mention it a little bit, just in terms of the overarching process. I mean, I was very not specific again in like saying I want to speak to certain groups of people. It was just let me speak to who I can speak to, and then from that conversation led me to another person and led me to another person. So in some senses, the interviews were almost just like conversations, obviously about a specific topic, but it was just, I mean, it couldn't have, in some senses, it was almost as much as like, go to a motor park, right? Find someone and be like, hey, what do you know about HIV/AIDS? Like, that was how it happened sometimes. And then that person would say, oh, well, I know this. And then, they, might not want to talk to you at first. And then, I explain what I was trying to do. Oh, okay, they relax and talk a little bit more. And then the discussion opens up and they're like, oh, but, you should actually talk to this person who, and then from there you get a whole ecosystem of people that you can speak to. And so in that sense, very informal and not maybe the more staged discussions that one would have in the exam room. If you're having a conversation about something in somebody's, like the motor park where they work and they're like, there's music playing around, like you're sitting down with like, soft drinks between you or beers or whatever, right? Like that's a very different kind of conversation. Of course now, like, when you bring out the tape recorder or the pencil and paper, that changes the whole dynamic. But I was lucky in that I was able to have these kind of free-flowing, open discussions because it was in contexts I think that people were very comfortable in to begin with, even if we were talking about an uncomfortable subject, right? From my side, I mean, I was, I think both people involved in the interview, we were all just very aware that like we were talking about something uncomfortable, and I mean, I was acutely aware of. Sort of to that question before of like how I appeared to people, especially because of the way that I sound, right? And also just because of people would ask who you are, and like if I say my last name in Nigeria, then there's an automatic association, so people are very aware of who they're speaking to, and like that can impact the discussion quite a bit. So I was just, I was acutely, I would say that in some senses, I was probably the more nervous of the parties. Then again, because you're also asking questions that people don't like really want to talk about. So I was there like feeling very nervous. I would be the one who was, I think, and I can only speak for myself in a lot of these. I don't know, because we didn't get into like how did you feel about being interviewed by me? And maybe I should have asked that question. But I was quite nervous a lot of the time when speaking about HIV/AIDS and asking all these questions. Again, because like, you wonder how much license you have to sort of pry into people's personal and private lives, right? And that was, I mean, what I found eventually was like, as soon as you were bold enough to ask the question, and I would always start with like beating around the bush, like kind of, but eventually you have to talk about sex if you're talking about HIV/AIDS, and so you're like this, that, and finally, like when it just got to like, okay, let's just talk about it, like, what do you think about sex? What do you think about, and usually like, what do you think about premarital sex, right? Or sex outside of marriage, which would get people talking. You could talk about sex within marriage all you wanted, and you wouldn't get. But if you asked that specific question, then it would just open up discussion, and then you would get a whole lot of stuff that people couldn't stop talking about, like about experiences and how these experiences were related to HIV/AIDS, and how HIV/AIDS made them think about their interactions with people, their sexual interactions with people, and whatnot. I mean, like so there was that, and then of course, if you would ask about death and HIV/AIDS, right? Then that would, the more direct and specific, right? Once we were comfortable, the more people would just like go, and you would almost not be able to stop them. And I mean, from that, I got that people really wanted to talk about this. It's just that there weren't, like the forum didn't exist for people to really actually feel safe about speaking on this. And a lot of people. The other thing was just like anonymity, of course, as well. It was like, as long as people knew that you weren't going to say who they were, most people were like, well, we'll talk about anything, like now that I know you. But, and then there were some people, mostly the activists, who were like, look, I will go on record as me because I want people to know my particular story. And I want people to know that I am not afraid. And that was as much a part of the message that they were putting forth, is that I am not afraid to share this story. And I think we need to be very clear about not being afraid to share this story. And that's extremely important.
So you were either the best person to be asking these questions or the worst.
The worst, right.
I don't know which. So I'm looking at the frame shift that that is underway, and following up on Sayantani's question from earlier. 3 quick scenes. I'm attending on the wards at Columbia a year or 2 ago. I have a multicultural team of about 10 doctors and medical students. And I asked kind of on a whim, how many of us speak the language of our grandparents? And out of the 10 or 12 of us, there was 1. Yeah. And the Korean American didn't speak Korean, and the Jewish student didn't speak Yiddish, and I don't really speak French Canadian. And the Tamil, the one who spoke the language of the grandparents was Tamil, but the others did not.
Right.
That interested me. And then I'm thinking about Alexander Heyman's recent essay called Aquarium. It was in the New Yorker about a year ago, where he and his wife and his baby girl dying of a brain tumor feel like they're in an aquarium. And everybody else who's not involved in that illness is outside of the aquarium, altogether. They can look in if they choose to, but most don't look in. 3rd scene, right here in this room now, I noticed sitting up there that there's a gas jet on that counter, like for a Bunsen burner.
Yeah.
I'm saying, what is this doing here? And then I look, and it's the periodic table up there. Yeah. So we're in a science lab, and we're involved in the science of these situations. So all of these, so these are frame shifts. And I think what Sayantani was encouraging you to talk about before is kind of the friction between what we might have called identity politics or actually essentialism versus a kind of democratization so broad that it loses any meaning. Right. And how do we talk about a particular, whether it's HIV/AIDS in Nigeria or brain tumors in infants or whatever the case may be, how do we talk about particulars with, again, using Sayantani's work, the narrative humility to not get simply embroiled in our own self-interest, reaching to those who are outside the tank, who have power. I don't know. And I think this is the shift in the narratological frame that you're embarking on.
No, I mean, I think... No, I mean, it's like a good question, an interesting frame. I think that like the frame shift again, and I think I was getting at that again when talking about just how the continent is viewed and how and you know how that's changing, right? Because that, you know, in terms of democratization, access to information, and more importantly, access to the means to disseminate your work, your voice, right? I think is in a lot of ways, I mean, if, for example, the tank that we're talking about, right, are these old perceptions, right, that like people from outside are really looking in at this continent and have all these ideas and have constructed this wall between the continent and them, and that like things like HIV/AIDS, I guess initially were also, you know, part of that framework of this like this barrier between like inside they have it, you know, and there's no distinction, you know, about they inside. It's just like inside this place has it, right, and outside we don't, right. You know, I think what I was trying to do with this book, and what I think a lot of other people in the narratives that they put together on this book and other subjects, right? I mean, I think you see a lot of stuff about like how Africa is changing. Africa is waking up, this, that, and the third, right? I think all of these narratives are about changing, or like at least, I mean, yeah, not. I don't want to use the term breaking down the glass, but like just expanding, right? What the tank is essentially, if we want to say it that way. That like, look, you are. One, first of all, defining the contents of what tank you want to create, and then two, expanding what is inside of that framework, right? And that is that's a process that does create a lot of noise, right, and a lot of friction. I mean, like, if you want to talk about HIV/AIDS now, I mean, I think you have to be, and I perhaps suffer from this in this book a lot. Like, you have to be very careful, right, because a lot of hopefully a lot of people will read it, but like, you know, there are a lot of different voices and opinions, both inside and outside, that deserve to be heard and that will argue against or argue for or like supplement or complement or also criticize what you're doing. I think you have to be aware of that discussion that's happening and incorporate, and I try to do this, incorporate the idea that that could happen in the actual writing that you're doing, which was very frustrating and infuriating at times. But then, I mean, just in general, yeah, I mean, I think it's and I find it now, and I think a lot of us who write about sub-Saharan Africa are really trying to do this, or trying to be aware of what writing about or adding to the conversation does to the actual conversation. And it's a fun place to be. I mean, I think he mentioned that I own and run this magazine, this business-oriented magazine with an uncle of mine. That seeks to, again, in different contexts, but seeks to do that. It's like, look, it's not just that these stories exist and that someone should tell them. It's that we should be telling them, and not that anyone else shouldn't tell them, but we should be telling them so that the narratives we have interact with the narratives that everyone else has, and that from there we can get a more comprehensive narrative that really makes sense, as opposed to just you're narrating from out there and you only have the right to tell that perspective, and we're from in here and we only have the right to put this perspective together. I mean, I think that it seems to me that's a lot of how it was before, and a lot of how people talked about lit that was coming out of the continent. Like, you people are inside, you're writing about an authentic experience inside. We're writing about an experience looking in, like from the outside, and this is our overarching, all-encompassing experience. And I mean, I think by and large now that people are just understanding that can't work anymore. The more people have access to means to tell their story, and I think it's a all-around positive thing. But it's going to be a while before you get, I think, stories that really, because again, like with all this sort of democratization of access to information, like a lot of stuff just comes out, but like a lot of it is hard to parse through and really figure out what it is you're getting at. I mean, we find that a lot with the magazine that we publish. Right, where there are a billion stories every day about different aspects of it, it's just hard to figure out like which ones make sense and which ones you should print and which ones you should then use to represent your own particular viewpoint. And that's just within one publication, right? So I can't imagine like the larger thing.
Can I actually follow up with a brief question that I think touches on some of the conversations that's gone on? A few minutes ago, you talked about in the conversations, the interviews with AIDS about HIV/AIDS. That one of the problems that people found is that, or that you found in those conversations, that there wasn't really a form, that there didn't exist a form in which to speak about HIV/AIDS. And I'm really interested, as a literary scholar, in this question of form. But it strikes me that one of the problems that you laid out at the very beginning of your talk, with regard to the ad campaign, that We Are All Africa, is that the conversations about AIDS in Africa for a long time, HIV/AIDS in Africa, suffer from there are too many forms about what HIV and AIDS means, and also the sort of colonial forms in which we speak about AIDS. In which we speak about Africa, and that those really have shaped. Have shaped the conversation in really important ways. So my question is a question about form for you. I'm curious about if not the struggles, sort of the formal questions and the formal experimentation you went through as you eventually settled on the narrative structure that you did. You touched on this very briefly at the beginning, that you eventually decided on the first person, but I'm curious if this went through many forms in your writing process as you worked your way through.
It did. I mean, and it was mainly just, so what I did was I would interview people. I'd record most interviews. Some I would just write down, but I recorded most of the interviews, and then I transcribed them myself. And I have, one of the things I am just very interested in, I think in the first book I wrote, it's like very much about how the character sounds if you read it aloud, right? So I was also very interested in how to represent a lot of these voices as if they were speaking. But then, of course, you run into the idea that, like, when people speak, they don't tell stories, and I'm sure everybody just don't tell stories in, like, a story fashion, right? In the fashion that makes sense when it's printed, right? It makes sense when you hear it, right? And, like, all the interjections, pauses, whatever, but, like, when you put it on the page, it doesn't make any sense. So I went through a lot of, like, how close to the actual way that people were that they spoke into the tape recorder, for example. How close to that should it be? And then, there were a lot of questions about how much license do you have in terms of moving things around, right? Or like sort of shaping the way that people spoke. Do you have to do that and then still be able to call it nonfiction? And then the other question, of course, was like, how distant are you from the actual experience? Like, do you write about it as something that you just observed, right? That you were sort of this non-existent, or present but not interactive or interacting person, or do you write about it as somebody who is fully immersed, and what sort of, how does that impact the text itself? And I wrote both versions. I mean, I wrote as someone who's much more distant, who, very removed from what was happening. So it was just the person speaking, and then sort of a more academic, if you will, commentary on like what they were saying. And that, aside from not really getting the point across, it was just bad writing. just was not very interesting to read. And, and this is, when you show it to people who are like, what are you talking? It was confusing, right? What are you talking about? We feel that you're holding back because there's a lot you want to say, right, that you can't say because you feel like you have to be distant and let the person speaking speak, and also be objective, or I guess the word is more like scientific is what someone said. And they're like, decide what you're writing. Like, are you writing a scientific book? If you're doing that, then like you have to go back and do a lot more research so that you can step out and actually let the research speak for itself. Or are you writing a book about your experience, right? In which case you need to step in and be present in the experience that you had, and allow yourself to be a character. Which I was talking with somebody who was asking me, like a student who was asking me about writing nonfiction, and I was saying, like, it's amazing that when writing, fiction is, I think, comes much easier to me, right? It's like something I will do. You don't have to worry about paying me for it. I'll just do it, But, when I do write fiction, after the initial sort of writing the story, I'll go back and I'll really spend a lot of time, like, doing what I call the technical work, which is like I'll write more in terms of character sketch than I will actually in terms of what actually goes into the narrative itself. And then rewrite the narrative based on what I now know about my character. So I can do, 40 pages of character sketching of one character, and then rewrite the story or the novel, with that in mind. And when I started off doing this, I didn't do that because I was just like, all right, well, it's a nonfiction book, whatever. But I found that I had to go back and construct myself as an actual character. And until I did that, it was very difficult to write this book. Like, once I finally sat down and said, okay, I need to look at the people I'm interviewing as characters, and I need to look at myself as a character interacting with these people, right? And that this is a representation. Yes, it's me, but like it's really a representation of me. Once I got that part set in my head, it became a lot easier to then figure out how to shape the rest of the narrative around my thoughts and like these characters, me as a character within this narrative. Which is not to say that it's not fictionalized at all, but it's just that it's also saying something that I'm sure we all know really well. Like, it's a constructed narrative. All of these things are constructed, right? That it's not the actual interaction itself. It's a representation of that, and you have to be very aware of that. And the text itself, I think, needs to be aware of that. So.
Well, thank you very much, and I think we're out of time. So please join me in really thanking.